John Norman Collins was born on June 17, 1947 in Ontario, Canada, as the youngest of 3 children. His mother worked as a waitress to support the family, while his biological father abandoned the family shortly after John's birth and played no role in his upbringing. It's said that during the period when he was around, he was immensely volatile and abusive. He was also an alcoholic. The absence of his father was only one part of a long chain of instabilities that would come to define John's early childhood. Within a short period of his father's departure, his mother remarried. This second husband was also an alcoholic and physically abusive. The marriage lasted only about a year. It was during his mother's second marriage, when John was roughly 3 years old, that 2 incidents occurred that would later be cited as significant early trauma markers. In the first incident, John's stepfather threw John across the inside of the family vehicle during a violent argument with his mother. In the second incident, this same stepfather got into a confrontation with another man who pulled a gun on him. Rather than face the armed man directly, the stepfather grabbed John and held him up as a human shield. John was also documented as still wearing diapers to school at age 5, a potential sign of stunted development or emotional distress. In 1951, when John was 4 years old, his mother left the second husband and relocated with all 3 children to Detroit, Michigan. There, she met and eventually married a man named William Collins, who legally adopted all 3 of her children. William Collins was, unfortunately, a continuation of the same pattern. He too was a violent alcoholic. The marriage to William lasted until 1956, when John was 9 years old. By that point in his life, John had already lived under the roof of 3 different volatile father figures. It was also noted that John's mother frequently went bar hopping with her husbands while leaving all 3 of her children alone in the car. Despite the chaos of his early years, John managed to construct what seemed to be a stable life when he reached adolescence. The family settled in Centerline, Michigan, a working-class suburb north of Detroit, and John attended St. Clement's High School. Teachers and peers described him as a model student and a standout athlete. He graduated as an honor student, was a captain of the football team, president of the C Club for varsity athletes, and the star pitcher of the baseball team. He dated regularly throughout high school and was regarded as an easy and normal person to talk to. There is also evidence that he began engaging in petty criminal behavior during his high school years. He reportedly committed burglaries while in high school, not because he needed money, but for the thrill of it. The stolen items were rarely valuable. After graduating high school in 1965, John enrolled at Central Michigan University for 1 year. In 1966, he transferred to Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti because he wanted to major in elementary education and focus on teaching upper elementary grades. At EMU, he initially adapted well to campus life. He joined the Theta Chi fraternity, became vice president of the ski club, continued playing sports, and maintained his reputation as a friendly and approachable person. He worked a part-time clerical job at EMU's McKinney Union. He was also living near campus and had a motorcycle to get around. At various points in his time at EMU, he owned 4 motorcycles, maintaining them with stolen parts. His relationship with his motorcycles was described as almost obsessive. The cracks in John's public image finally began to appear during his sophomore year. His grades started to drop noticeably, and one of his professors formally accused him of cheating. Around the same time, reports emerged of petty thefts on campus, and John was ultimately expelled from his fraternity under suspicion of stealing from fellow members. Afterward, he became more of a loner and spent more time riding his motorcycles. It was during this period that he met Andrew Manuel, a man who would become a significant figure in John's life. Manuel was a petty criminal from Salinas, California, who had relocated to Ypsilanti. The 2 men bonded over their shared willingness to steal for entertainment. Together, they engaged in car thefts, auto parts burglaries, and other criminal activity. Their friendship solidified and encouraged John's existing criminal instincts. John also got increasingly comfortable with identity fraud during this period. When he and Manuel later traveled to California in 1969, the camper trailer they took was rented under a false name and paid for with a stolen check using the identity of an EMU student whose wallet had been stolen the week before. Another significant part from John's college years involved his own sister, Gail. He discovered that Gail had become pregnant by a man who was not her husband despite being married at the time. John reacted explosively. He confronted the man, beat him unconscious, and then turned on his own sister, hitting her until she bled while calling her a tramp. There were no legal consequences from this assault, as Gail did not press charges. Furthermore, several women who dated John during his time in college described him as overly aggressive when engaging in intimacy. He was prone to sudden bouts of intense anger and was almost impossible to read from one moment to the next. A particularly disturbing detail surfaced during a later interview. John had reportedly told a girlfriend at some point that he had strangled a cat with a clothesline. Several people also described an incident in which he put his hands around a girlfriend's throat during an argument to make a point, stopping just short of applying pressure. While he didn't actually harm the woman in that instance, he was deliberately demonstrating that he was physically stronger and was capable of harm if he so wanted. Another distinctive trait noted by former girlfriends is that John would become enraged when women were menstruating. He told at least one girlfriend that he could smell when it was happening. All of John's erratic behavior would come to a head in 1967 in an event involving a woman named Mary Flesser, who was born in 1947 in Willis, Michigan. Mary had 6 siblings and was described as a driven and academically accomplished young woman. After graduating high school in 1965, she enrolled at Eastern Michigan University as an accounting student. At approximately 9 p.m. on July 9, 1967, a neighbor observed Mary walking toward her apartment along a quiet street. Twice during that short walk, the neighbor watched a young man driving a blue-gray Chevrolet slow to a stop beside her and attempt to initiate a conversation. Both times, Mary shook her head and walked on. The neighbor assumed the driver was offering her a ride, which she declined. She never arrived home. Her parents reported her missing the following day after her roommate confirmed she had not come back the previous evening. Her nude body was found nearly a full month later on August 7th by 2 teens near an abandoned farmhouse in Superior Township. Her remains were so badly decomposed that identification required dental records. Despite the level of decomposition, a pathologist was able to share significant findings. Mary had been stabbed approximately 30 times in the chest and abdomen with a sharp instrument. Both feet had been severed just above the ankles. The thumb and sections of several fingers from one hand were missing, and an entire forearm had been removed from her body. It was speculated that she may have also been violated, but this could not be confirmed as a result of the decomposition. A careful examination of the crime scene revealed additional intriguing details. Mary's body had been repositioned 3 separate times over the nearly month-long period it had gone undiscovered. Initially, the body had been placed among a pile of bottles and cans hidden beneath elder trees. It was then dragged 5 feet into an open field, where it remained exposed to the elements for the bulk of the time it lay there. Shortly before the remains were discovered, the killer had returned yet again and moved it a further 3 feet. 2 days after Mary was formally identified, a young man arrived at the funeral home where her body was being prepared for burial. He introduced himself as a friend of the family and asked permission to photograph the body in the coffin as a keepsake for her parents. When the receptionist told him it was not possible, he pushed back, insisting that he get a picture. He was told a second time firmly that it was not going to happen, and he left without another word. Mary's family confirmed that they had no such friend and had requested no such photograph. The receptionist described the young man as a handsome, dark-haired white male of approximately 20 years old who had driven an old blue Chevrolet. This matched the car described by the neighbor who had observed the man approach Mary on the night she disappeared. Interestingly, John was later confirmed to have been working in a building at EMU with a direct line of sight to the workplace where Mary worked, meaning John likely regularly crossed paths with her. Furthermore, the Chevrolet in question was also found to match a vehicle registered to John's mother. Despite this information, officials were unable to connect the dots initially, allowing John to continue his killing spree. The second victim was named Joan Schell, who was born in 1947 in New Paris, Wisconsin. She was attending EMU as an art student and was 20 years old during her encounter with John. On the evening of June 30th, 1968, Schell wanted to travel to Ann Arbor to visit her boyfriend but discovered she had missed the last bus. Her roommate Susan Colby accompanied her to the Washtenaw Avenue bus stop, where Schell decided she would hitchhike the rest of the way. One of the first vehicles to pass was a red and black Pontiac Bonneville carrying 3 young white men. The driver slowed and asked Schell if she wanted a ride. He was described by Colby as approximately 6 feet tall, around 20 years old, with short, dark, side-parted hair, and was wearing a green EMU t-shirt. Colby begged her not to get in. Schell dismissed her concerns, promised a call once she arrived at her boyfriend's apartment, and climbed into the vehicle. The call never came. At 1:47 a.m. on July 1st, Colby reported her roommate missing after receiving no word. About a week later, Schell's mutilated and partially decomposed body was found by construction workers on an Ann Arbor roadside. The autopsy confirmed she had been violated, then stabbed 25 times with a knife. Her miniskirt had also been tied around her neck. The absence of blood beneath or near the body led investigators to conclude it had been stored elsewhere and then transported and dumped. The condition of the corpse provided an interesting detail. While her entire lower body was in a remarkably preserved condition, her upper body had undergone advanced decomposition. This led the pathologist to conclude her killer had kept her body in a cool environment, but with the upper third of her body exposed to warmth. As with Mary, the wound patterns were so similar that investigators immediately linked the 2 murders and assigned 4 full-time detectives to work both cases simultaneously. 2 months after Schell's murder, 2 witnesses independently came forward to state they had seen Schell walking with a young man along Emmett Street on the evening she disappeared. Neither could be certain of the identity, but both believed the man matched John Collins, who lived directly across the street from Schell. Police went to John and questioned him. He denied knowing Schell at all and told officers he had spent the entire weekend with his mother at her house in Centerline, Michigan, and had not returned to Ypsilanti until the morning of July 1st. Investigators accepted this alibi and moved on without contacting his mother to verify it. Fast forward to 1969, on March 20th, John would strike his 3rd victim. Her name was Jane Mixer, and she was enrolled at the University of Michigan Law School. She had recently become engaged and was planning to move to New York City after graduation. On March 20th, Mixer posted a handwritten note on a university bulletin board seeking a ride from a fellow student to her hometown of Muskegon, where she intended to share the news of her engagement with her family. The note said, "Would appreciate hearing from anyone who might be driving to Muskegon or vicinity anytime Thursday, March 20th. She included her name, dorm room, and phone number. That afternoon, she attempted to reach a student named David Johnson, believing he had responded to her request. Johnson denied having done so and provided investigators with a solid alibi for the evening. Mixer was never seen alive again after that phone call. The very next day, her fully clothed body was found early in the morning. It was laid out atop a grave in Denton Cemetery. Her own raincoat had been draped over her, and a copy of the novel Catch-22 had been placed beside her. The autopsy confirmed she had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber pistol and then strangled with a nylon stocking that did not belong to her. The pathologist placed her time of death at approximately 3 a.m. on March 21st and confirmed she had not been killed at the cemetery. Several features of Mixer's murder stood apart from the others in the series. She was clothed, not beaten, not mutilated, and was shot rather than stabbed or strangled. Yet because she was a young female student and had a garment tied around her neck, investigators linked her murder to the others. In 2001, DNA testing of material recovered from her pantyhose produced a match to Gary Leiterman, a 62-year-old retired nurse with no known link to John. Gary was convicted of her murder in 2005 and sentenced to life without parole. The conviction, however, generated significant controversy. A second unrelated DNA profile belonging to a 4-year-old child was found on the same evidence, and defense experts argued the results were products of laboratory cross-contamination rather than genuine biological trace evidence from the crime. Gary maintained his innocence until his death in prison on July 4th, 2019. Shortly after, on March 23rd, a woman named Marilyn Skelton went missing outside a drive-in restaurant on Washtenaw Avenue in Ann Arbor where she had been hitchhiking. 2 days later, a surveyor discovered Marilyn's nude and brutally mutilated body lying face up on a blue jacket atop a wooded knoll behind a vacant house on a remote road. The site was used by students as a lover's lane and was located just a few hundred yards from where Shell's body had been found 8 months earlier. The killer had positioned the body in a degrading manner. Blood spatterings and churned soil near the scene indicated she had been beaten close to where her body was left and may have attempted to escape, though heavy rainfall had erased any tire tracks or footprints. An investigator with 30 years of experience told colleagues he had never in his career witnessed anything as horrific as this crime scene. The autopsy revealed Marilyn had died of numerous fractures covering 1/3 of her skull and one side of her face, all inflicted by a heavy, blunt instrument. Before those fatal blows, her killer had subjected her to a prolonged torture. A section of her own shirt had been stuffed into her trachea to muffle her screaming while she was beaten with what appeared to be a leather strap. An 8-inch branch had also been broken off a nearby tree and inserted inside of her body. A garter belt had been tied around her neck, and her clothing and shoes had been neatly folded and placed beside her body. Shortly after this discovery, a janitor at a nearby apartment complex contacted investigators to state that a man matching the composite description of the suspect had regularly visited an apartment adjacent to one Marilyn had frequently visited in the months before her murder. Following the discovery of the fourth victim, law enforcement from 5 separate jurisdictions formally combined their investigative resources for the first time. By early April 1969, the collective effort had assigned 20 investigators to work exclusively on the murders. The common denominators included their appearance, vicinity to one another, an item of clothing tied around their necks, and all had been menstruating at the time of their deaths. On April 15th of the same year, a woman named Dawn Basum was last seen alive walking home from a friend's house at 7:30 p.m. She had been accompanied partway by a friend named Earl Kidd, who parted ways with her at a desolate road just 5 blocks from her home, where she began walking alone alongside railroad tracks. A single eyewitness reported seeing her at approximately 7:35 p.m. Her movements after that point were never established. Her body was found at 6:30 a.m. the following morning, lying beside a desolate road in Ypsilanti. She was clothed only in a white blouse and bra which had been pushed up around her neck. She had been repeatedly stabbed in the chest and genitals, and had received multiple slash wounds measuring up to 8 inches across her body. She had been strangled with electrical flex that remained knotted around her neck at the time of discovery. Officials also found a handkerchief stuffed in her mouth. Following the discovery of her body, investigators traced evidence to a derelict farmhouse approximately 100 yards away. Inside the basement, they found Dawn's orange mohair sweater, additional articles of her clothing, extra electrical flex, and fresh human bloodstains. This specific area was later determined to be the location in which she actually died. 1 week later, during a routine follow-up examination of the farmhouse, a detective discovered a scrap of cloth from Dawn's blouse and, more significantly, a gold earring belonging to Marilyn Skelton. About a month later, on May 13th, the farmhouse was destroyed in an act of arson. When the fire was extinguished, investigators found 5 clipped lilac blossoms arranged in an even row across the driveway. Officials believed these to symbolize the victims the killer had murdered. John had been identified during this period as a regular visitor to an apartment complex directly across from Dawn's family home. A former girlfriend of John's confirmed that he had met Dawn on multiple occasions during the time he was visiting her at that address. The sixth victim was named Alice Cullum. She was 21 years old, and on June 8, 1969, she attended a party at a friend's house. She was last seen shortly after midnight walking toward her Thompson Street apartment. A witness would later tell investigators that John had been seen arguing with Alice shortly before she vanished. The next day, 3 teenagers discovered her body in a field close to an abandoned farmhouse on North Territorial Road. Articles of her clothing were scattered around her body, and one of her shoes was missing. Like the previous victims, she sustained multiple slash and stab wounds throughout her body. Her forehead also bore a gunshot wound as well as her right thumb. Officials also confirmed that she had been violated at some point during the ordeal. On June 10th, investigators were able to pinpoint the actual murder site after discovering dried bloodstains and 2 buttons from Alice's raincoat at a commercial Gravely pit in Northfield Township. She had been killed there and transported to the field where she was found. A boot print found on her body would later be confirmed as matching John's boots. By the summer of 1969, the area surrounding EMU and the University of Michigan had descended into community-wide fear. Female students refused to walk anywhere unaccompanied. A formal buddy system had been adopted across campuses, with women refusing to be alone unless accompanied by a trusted male friend or a group of at least 3 other women. Sales of tear gas, knives, and security locks had spiked dramatically across Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti as well. Hitchhiking, which was commonplace at the time, had also become effectively taboo. The reward offered for information leading to the killer's arrest had grown from an initial $7,800 to $42,000 by July 1969, equivalent to roughly $370,000 today. By that same month, the Coordinated Task Force had investigated and eliminated more than 1,000 convicted offenders as suspects and had followed up on over 800 tips from the public, all without producing a viable arrest. Several thousand individuals had been interviewed across the 2 campuses and surrounding communities. The investigation had become so desperate that the local community requested psychic Peter Hurkos come and weigh in on the killings. By July 23rd of the same year, another woman was killed. Her name was Karen Beanman and was only 18 years old at the time. She was a first-year student at EMU and was visiting a wig shop on Washington Street. Shop owner Diana Gosha observed a young man outside as Karen walked around the store. The man was described as young, with short brown hair, wearing a horizontal striped sweater, and waiting on a blue motorcycle parked about 30 feet from the shop entrance. When Karen completed her purchase and headed for the door, she jokingly told Diana to take notice of the man waiting for her, explaining that she had done 2 foolish things that day, those being buying the wig and accepting a ride from a stranger. Her exact words, as recalled by Diana, were, "I've got to be either the bravest or the dumbest girl alive, because I've just accepted a ride from this guy." She watched her climb onto the motorcycle behind the young man and ride away. A clerk from the chocolate shop next door named Carol observed the motorcycle and was later able to identify the model as a Triumph. Karen failed to return to her dorm by curfew that evening. At 10 p.m., her roommate Sherry Green reported her missing to campus police. 3 days later, her body was found face down in a wooded gully alongside the Huron River Parkway. What the autopsy revealed was among the most extreme violence documented in the entire series. She had been extensively beaten and suffered extensive skull and brain injuries from blunt force trauma that the pathologist stated would likely have proven fatal on their own. She had been forced to ingest a caustic substance and had been burned with the same agent all over her body. As had been done with multiple prior victims, a section of cloth had been placed in her throat to muffle her screaming during the torture, and she died of strangulation. Aware that the killer had returned to at least 3 previous murder sites to move or interact with his victims' bodies, investigators made the decision to suppress all public news of Karen's discovery. Her body was replaced with a mannequin purchased from a JCPenney store, and the gully was surrounded by concealed undercover officers watching the site around the clock. This plan yielded promising results. At approximately 12:15 a.m. on July 27th, in the middle of a heavy, humid thunderstorm, one of the officers observed a young man running from the gully, but the rain and insect interference had prevented the officer from seeing the man actually approach the mannequin. He immediately attempted to radio the sighting to his colleagues, but the weather had rendered his radio inoperable, and the man disappeared into the darkness. The identity of this individual was never confirmed, but investigators believed it to be John. Shortly after, he was formally placed under surveillance after several witnesses identified him from photos. In total, 7 witnesses were eventually identified who could testify to having seen John in the area between the EMU campus and the wig shop between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on July 23rd. Among these were 3 young women who told officers that John had, on that same afternoon, repeatedly attempted to entice them onto his motorcycle. One of these women recalled him telling her he did not appreciate women having their ears pierced because piercings, quote, left holes that defile their bodies. That same month, undercover officers arrived at the apartment John shared with his roommate Arnold Davis at Emmett Street. When confronted with witness accounts against him, John yelled out that he was innocent, and anyone who identified him as a suspect had made a mistake. He refused to return to the station to take a polygraph test. That same evening, after police had left the apartment, Davis observed John emerge from his bedroom carrying a cardboard box partially covered by a blanket. As Davis held the door open, he was able to see the box's contents. There was a woman's purple leather shoe, rolled up denim, and a burlap purse. 30 minutes later, he returned to the apartment and told Davis simply that he had decided to get rid of the box. Davis later testified that John had previously kept 2 separate boxes in his bedroom and that one had been destroyed prior to his arrest while the other was recovered by Michigan State Police from beneath his bed. Its contents were believed to be crime scene souvenirs from multiple murders. John's uncle, Police Sergeant David Leake, had been away on a family vacation during the period in which Karen disappeared and was murdered. John had been given sole access to the Leake family home in Ypsilanti's College Heights neighborhood during the vacation to care for the family's German Shepherd. When Leake and his wife Sandra returned home on July 29th, Sandra immediately noticed that multiple sections of the concrete basement floor had been freshly coated in black spray paint. Additionally, several household items were missing from the home, including a bottle of ammonia, a box of laundry detergent, and the canister of black spray paint now covering the basement floor. The implication was alarming, but Lake was not yet aware of his nephew's suspect status. Later that same day, investigators informed Leake that John had emerged as the primary suspect in Karen's murder. Leake reviewed the evidence briefing and acknowledged the case was compelling, but notably, he did not yet disclose the paint marks or the missing items to the officers. It was not until the following morning that Leake, unable to ignore what he had found, scraped back a section of the black paint covering the basement floor and found beneath it what appeared to be a dark stain resembling dried blood. He immediately drove to the police station and reported the discovery. A forensic team was dispatched to his home that morning for an intensive examination of the basement. One of the investigators noticed beside the family's washing machine a collection of human hair clippings similar in color and dimension to the 509 hair clippings recovered from Karen's underwear. Leake was asked about where the hairs had come from, and he said his wife regularly cut the children's hair in this basement and had done so shortly before the family departed on vacation. Crucially, Leake had not been informed about the hair clippings found on Karen's clothing before this conversation. In addition to the hair clippings, investigators found bloodstains in 9 separate areas of the basement that had not been covered by the black spray paint. 2 of those bloodstains were confirmed to be type A blood, matching Karen. The hair samples from both the basement and the crime scene were then subjected to forensic neutron activation analysis, the most precise hair comparison technology available in 1969. The results produced a precise match. Despite John's continued denials of ever having met Karen, she had at some point been in that basement. Later neighborhood interviews corroborated these results. One neighbor named Marjorie Barnes told investigators she had seen John leaving the Leak home carrying a large laundry detergent box before the family returned from vacation. A second neighbor reported that on the evening of July 23rd, the night Karen disappeared, she had clearly heard the muffled screaming of a young woman coming from inside the house. On the afternoon of July 30th, while investigators were still processing the laboratory results from the basement, John was confronted with the evidence that had been assembled against him. Interestingly, officers informed him that the areas that had been spray painted seemed to only have been covered in varnish which resembled dried blood. Instead of instantly revealing that Karen's blood was indeed found, they were able to fish out a suspicious reaction from John. Upon hearing this, John burst into what seemed like tears of relief. But within moments he regained his composure and returned to denying the accusations. He stated that he knew nothing about Karen and had never met her in his life. That same day, John's apartment and vehicles were thoroughly searched. Officers found numerous stolen items, and Davis confirmed that John had long engaged in burglaries with former roommate Andrew. No additional physical evidence directly linking John to Karen or any other murder victim was recovered from the apartment search. On August 1st, John was formally arraigned for the first-degree murder of Karen and held without bond. Within days, investigators received a call from officials in Salinas, California. Detectives there were investigating the June 30th murder of 17-year-old Roxy Ann Phillips and had developed information suggesting the killer may have been a Michigan man named John. On August 3rd, two Washtenaw County detectives traveled to the Salinas Police Department to review the California evidence. What they found was compelling. Phillips had told friends that she had met an EMU senior named John, who was temporarily staying in a camper trailer in the area and drove a silver gray Oldsmobile Cutlass. Investigators confirmed that John and Andrew had traveled to Monterey on June 21, 1969 in John's Oldsmobile Cutlass, towing a camper trailer they had rented under false names using a stolen check. A 17-year-old named Nancy Albrecht told investigators she had become acquainted with John on June 29th and introduced him to her friend Roxy the following day. The composite that Nancy formed via the identikit months earlier bore a striking physical resemblance to John Collins. Physical evidence tied the California case tightly to John as well. He had sought medical treatment in California for severe anaphylaxis caused by poison oak exposure, and Roxy Phillips's body had been found in a ravine densely covered in poison oak. Investigators also noted pubic hairs on John's sweater that were consistent with Phillips's hair. A grand jury in Monterey County formally indicted John for the Phillips murder in April 1970. However, Michigan Governor William Milliken ultimately denied California Governor Ronald Reagan's extradition request, and California dropped the case after John's Michigan conviction was secured. Immediately following John's arrest, his mother Loretta retained two Ann Arbor attorneys, Robert Francis and John M. Toomey, to represent her son. The arrangement barely lasted a week. At a preliminary examination on August 7th, Toomey told presiding Judge Edward D. Deek that he and his partner were considering withdrawing from the case due to John's family being unable to sustain the financial demands of a protracted murder defense. Judge Deek agreed to appoint counsel at the county's expense. And on August 12th, a three-judge circuit court panel assigned Richard W. Ryan to lead John's defense, with Francis and Toomey remaining as co-counsels. Then, within a matter of weeks, he asked John to take a polygraph test, conducted off the record so its results would be inadmissible at trial. He agreed. Ryan reviewed the results and said nothing publicly, but shortly afterward, he met privately with John's family in the judge's chambers and suggested a dramatic change in strategy. He advised them to pursue a diminished capacity plea, essentially an insanity defense, arguing that John was not mentally responsible for his actions. Loretta was furious. To her, this plea was a concession of guilt. She fired Ryan immediately and within days began seeking one of the most expensive and well-regarded defense firms in Michigan. On November 25, 1969, the Detroit News reported that Joseph W. Lewisell and his partner Neil Fink of Detroit had agreed to take John's case after a 2-week series of consultations with the family. They formally took over the defense on December 1st. When a reporter asked how Loretta, who had pleaded poverty in open court barely 3 months earlier, could now afford the highest priced defense firm in the state, neither Joseph nor Neil provided an answer. Joseph and Neil immediately pursued a change of venue motion, arguing that the news coverage of the Michigan murders across the county had made it impossible to assemble an impartial jury. The motion was denied. They revisited this argument several times leading up to the trial, but were denied each time. John's trial officially opened on June 30th, 1970 before Judge Conlin. Jury selection alone took nearly 2 weeks. The defense's strategy primarily revolved around attacking the reliability of the eyewitness identifications and the credibility of the forensic evidence. The case went to the jury on January 16th, 1971, after the jury had already been secluded in a hotel for a full month during the trial proceedings. After 4 long days, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder of Karen. John's mother, Loretta, audibly gasped when the verdict was announced. John himself showed no visible emotion. 1 hour after the proceedings concluded, he was loaded into a transport van and taken to Jackson State Prison. John and his attorneys refused to accept the verdict and mounted a sustained campaign to overturn the conviction through the courts. Ultimately, despite multiple efforts, the conviction was upheld. After 7 years of near-total silence, John granted a 3-hour interview to a reporter from the Ann Arbor News at Jackson State Prison in January 1977 at the age of 28. He denied the murder of Karen vehemently. He accused investigators of having withheld evidence that would have cleared him, claimed the jury had been bullied into a guilty verdict, and called the identification testimony against him false. He was also furious about Edward Keyes' recently published book, The Michigan Murders, as well as a proposed film adaptation, which he said were damaging his chances for any future legal relief. He offered no alternative explanation for the hair clippings, no account of what Karen might have been doing in his uncle's basement if not with him, and no named alternative suspect. In his early years at Jackson, he managed to secure a tutoring job working with other inmates. The position gave him the ability to move through different areas of the prison population and cultivate relationships across the facility. That arrangement ended when he was implicated in the disappearance of a large quantity of sugar from the prison kitchen during his food service job assignment. When a group of inmates were caught with homemade spud juice, John was identified as the source of the stolen sugar that had been used to ferment it. He subsequently lost all work privileges. Over the following years, he made what was characterized as several attempts to escape, earning him a Level 5 security classification. At Level 5, John was barred from any prison job assignment and restricted primarily to his cell. In the early 1980s, John had legally changed his last name from Collins to Chapman, the surname of his biological father, and had been operating under that name within the prison system. Whether this was a deliberate attempt to obscure his identity or something else entirely was never answered. Throughout the decades, he has maintained his innocence. He has been denied parole on every occasion. He has never offered a credible alternative account of events and has never provided any information to investigators about the other Michigan murders for which he was never tried. In 2019, Michigan State Police Detective Gary Lytelt sat down with John for an interview at the prison. Gary noted that John's denials had begun to show cracks. He avoided direct answers on several specific questions about the murders, made evasive statements about his whereabouts on dates he had previously claimed to remember clearly, and exhibited what Gary described as an unmistakable awareness of details that only the killer would possess. Yet there was still no confession. That same year, DNA evidence recovered from the clothing of Alice, who was the 6th victim, was confirmed as a positive match for John. However, this was not enough for new charges. The statute of limitations and the decades of elapsed time made prosecution on those counts effectively impossible, but it confirmed what investigators had believed for 50 years. As of 2024, John remains incarcerated at G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility in Michigan. He is 78 years old and was convicted of 1 murder. He is believed by the investigators who have spent careers studying this case to have committed at least 7.